Fishing like a local isn't just about catching fish. It's about connecting with the environment and the people who call it home. It's about hearing the stories and traditions that have been passed down for generations and sharing unforgettable moments with the people you meet along the way. Fishing like a local is having an experience that stays with you forever. And with Fishing Booker, you can experience it too, no matter where you are. Discover your next adventure on Fishing Booker.
I'm Erica Lynn, and we all know the ocean is the most demanding environment on Earth, consistently testing the reliability and durability of our equipment. When you spend as much time fishing as I do, you know that reliable gear is essential for staying on the water. This is why I went with the Abyss battery to power my trolling motor, electronics, and outboard. The guys at Abyss Battery are rattling the saltwater industry by manufacturing performance marine batteries specifically designed for sonar, outboards, trolling motors, and electronic fishing reels. They're also Bluetooth compatible, so I found checking battery statuses right on your phone while you're out on the water is a huge game changer. To learn more about why Abyss batteries are used by the pros and factory installed by premier boat builders, visit abyssbattery.com.
Hello and welcome to the Publicly Challenged Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Oswald, and I hope you join me on my quest for knowledge to become a better public land hunter, angler, and forager. Stick with this and who knows, maybe we will learn something together.
Welcome to another episode of the Publicly Challenged Podcast. And this time, it's not me and Luke, it's just me. And I'm here with Tom Wessels. And Tom Wessels, you are an absolutely inspiring individual to me. I cannot understate this. Been following you for years, and I'm blown away by the amount of knowledge you have. So please, for those of us who don't know who you are, please introduce yourself and tell us what you do.
Okay, well, I guess I'm a terrestrial ecologist, which means I'm interested in land-based ecosystems. So I think I'm best known for my work with forest ecosystems, but I have a strong interest in deserts and alpine and Arctic ecosystems. I am a former graduate school academic, and I guess even though I was trained to do ecological research, the focus of most of my work in graduate school was just actually teaching. I loved the teaching, and I was at an institution that valued that, so I invested myself in it. And I see the books I've written as sort of an extension of the teaching.
Yeah, well, you are an amazing teacher, and some of the for those that would like to maybe pause this and then go watch some of his videos, they're on the YouTube channel. I believe it's called New England Forests, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you could just search on YouTube Tom Wessels. Either way, they're amazing, and you go through and I'm actually like mind blown by the things that you can deduce from looking at a landscape. If you could just like really quickly just summarize like what sorts of things that you can figure out just by looking at a landscape.
Yeah, so I call the process forest forensics because it's not unlike going into a crime scene and gleaning it to find evidence to explain what happened there. And so I do it with interpreting forest histories, so I can tell if an area that's now forested was once agricultural land. Not only that, I can tell if it was formerly a crop field or a hay field or a pasture. I can determine when it was abandoned to grow back to forest. In terms of logging, I can tell how many times a forest has been logged. I can date those logging events. Same thing with wind disturbances. If there's multiple wind disturbances, I can usually pin down the type of storm and come pretty close to a guess on the date. And as well with fire as well. So it's a matter of sort of just looking at a forest, and what I first do is I'm just wandering through a forest. I'm just looking to see if there's changes in forest composition or structure. And then that gets me thinking about, all right, there's something going on here. If it's a change in forest structure, sizes of trees, density of trees, then I know I'm looking at different disturbance histories. So then I start gleaning the site for evidence to try to figure out, all right, what am I seeing? So that's sort of the process.
Oh, That's so amazing. One thing that maybe I haven't ever seen you talk about, but that interests me is the meandering of rivers
Uh-huh.
and how rivers can change place over time. And there's a kind of dramatic example by me where there's clearly a um, a big sharp cliff sort of thing, but then the river I guess it's a creek now, but the creek is a good 100 feet away from that spot. But you can tell that at one point in time, it probably did go through there and erode that whole bank off.
Yeah, and big rivers, as they meander, can really create large floodplain areas that can stretch a good half mile, a mile, or more on each side of the river. So they can really get to be quite dramatic.
Wow. So what sort of things would you look for if you were to be looking for like the place that a river had been? Like what things would you look for?
So I mean, so rivers, if they're like on a steep grade, just down cut pretty straight away. But when they get onto lower grades, then they start meandering. And so you're looking for these meander turns, like you said, in that bank. I'm sure that when
Mm,
you look at that bank, you were probably seeing a turn to it. They're often, when
hmm
they're doing that, that's where they're eroding the most, when they're making a turn. But you can also look for oxbows. These are sort of,
hmm
half moon shaped bodies of water that used to be the channel of the river, but then got blocked off by a flood event and separated as the river moved away. So those are just two things you can look for.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And and then because this is a hunting podcast, I can't help but bring up or hunting and foraging podcast. I can't help but bring up beavers and they're what they've done to the landscape. And I'm curious what you think may have happened as a result of the beaver fever, as we could call it. Um, how was our landscape before beaver fever? And then how did it change when we had less beavers on the landscape?
It was dramatically different before the extirpation of beavers. They are, without a doubt, our mammal in North America that, other than humans, alters the landscape quite dramatically. Um, and nowadays, we could benefit from them as we're getting all these flood events. And one thing beavers do is they control water and they really restrict floodwaters. They create these wetlands that are huge sponges that can absorb a lot of water. As we got rid of them, it just means when we get these heavy rain events, the rain's going right into rivers and streams and going straight down. And so we can get real dramatic water level rises. But there's a great book called Eager,
Mm,
the
mhm.
Eager Beaver, that really looks at the historical accounts of what the landscape looked like, particularly in the Midwest and out in the Rockies, prior to the extirpation of beavers. And it's amazing how different it was. I mean, our picture like now of the Great Plains is really different from when beavers were here. So it was a much more diverse ecosystem because of all these wetlands all over the place that were scattered and creating different successional stages. So they were really quite influential in creating a very, very diverse regional ecosystem and boosting a lot of species richness because of their presence.
Yeah. So that's interesting that you say that because in my mind, I've never actually thought because I live in northern Michigan. I don't really often sit around contemplating the Great Plains, but when I do think about the Great Plains, I think about kind of like endless expanses of grass, and I don't really think about the water aspect of it. So could you go into more of like what the Great Plains would have looked like with the
Well,
beavers?
it's a good question. I don't think I can actually remember because I read this about 10
Uh,
years ago, but I was
okay.
impressed. But yeah, what I did take away from it was how dramatically different our landscapes were.
Okay. All right. Cool. Yeah, and I imagine that there is probably a great deal of difference in where you live versus the landscapes of the Great Plains. Yeah.
Yeah. And even maybe if you're like in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan or something, it's gonna be different up there. I mean, when you get into forests that are a lot more coniferous based, then beaver activity is not going to be as heavy as it is in more hardwood forests because hardwoods are their preferred winter food supply trees. So
You would actually be surprised. So I don't live in the Upper Peninsula. I live in the northern lower, but I do go to the Upper Peninsula a lot, and there's a ton of beavers up there.
Good.
And it's actually pretty funny that you say that because so I engage in eating beavers. I would never go through and like extirpate a whole family unit, but maybe I'll have like a few a year.
Uh-huh.
And they are very, very tasty animals, but I really love them. I would call them my favorite animal. And I've seen many, many examples of them eating cedar trees and pine trees and things that other people would say that they would never eat. You know, and of course they obviously prefer aspens and willows, but I think when forced to, they will definitely eat whatever's around.
Well, they will, but it's a sign that they're, sort of they're getting a bit desperate because it's not really
Yeah.
their stuff. So it'd be like us eating something we really could eat, but really probably wouldn't choose to eat.
Yeah, yeah, no, I get you. Yeah. So, other than beavers, though, like what effects would things other animals have on the landscape, like specifically where you're at in New England? Um, do the movement of deer, do the movement of elk, things like that that historically did live in your area, were they going to have like dramatic effects on the land as well?
I think they are, and maybe not as dramatic as beaver, but I'll give you one example of a species that had really big impacts. When I was doing my undergraduate work at the University of New Hampshire back in the late 60s, early 70s, um, we are taught that if you went into an oak-dominated woodland, you'd never find white pine growing in the understory. And sure enough, every oak-dominated woodland we went into, we never found white pine in the understory because, the oak leaf litter restricts germination sites for pine. So it
Hmm.
made perfect sense. Well, um, now you can go into oak forests around here and easily find white pine and a lot of other species you never used to see of trees in the understory in oak-dominated woodlands because of the change in the population status of one species. So, any guess what that might be?
Whitetail deer.
Good guess, but it's not that. It's
Oh,
turkey.
oh,
Turkey.
turkeys.
Turkeys were reintroduced into New Hampshire in 1969.
Hmm.
And, having them not be present for, well over basically almost 2 centuries, uh, people just thought, well, this is the way the forest always looked. But when troops of turkeys go through a forest and they start scratching up the understory to look for, bugs and seeds and acorns and things like that, they create all these germination sites. So we're seeing now turkeys as a huge influence in basically dramatically increasing the diversity of species in the understory of our woodlands that we never would have caught on if they, if we never had them here. We just never would have known that.
That is amazing, and I'm sure based on some of the other stuff that I know, um, having Turkey create better woodlands and more diverse woodlands probably equals more turkeys in the end too, right?
Yeah, because now they're obviously allowing species to come in that might not have had as much success that, are going to be good foraging species for them. So sure.
Wow, that's that's pretty amazing. Um, so what other sorts of things do you do like on a daily basis? Do you help people assess their land and how to improve it and things
Uh,
like that?
Sometimes, I mean, most of what I do are public programs, speaking events, things like that. I get a lot of requests to take groups out in the field and just, basically interpret what I'm seeing out in the woodlands. And it's not just, interpreting forest histories. It could be looking at really cool, unique, co-evolved interrelationships that we find out in the natural world that many people don't know about, or unique growth forms of trees, or uh, you know, cool adaptations of, trees, plants, and other organisms out there. So,
Hmm.
as an ecologist, I'm mostly versed in looking at interrelationships. So a lot of that deals with interrelationships. If they're, like sun leaves or shade leaves and oaks, that's a relationship to growing conditions of the physical environment. If it's, resin blisters on balsam fir, well, that's an adaptation to deal with bark beetles. So there's these things that are occurring out there that just aren't random. They're co-evolved interactions that have developed. And, from an ecological perspective, the more coevolution you have taking place, the more biologically diverse and the more resilient our ecosystems get. Because nature's always pushing for organisms to be more energy efficient. There's only so much energy out there. So if an organism develops a strategy adaptation to make it more energy efficient, it gets selected for. But they do that by becoming more specialized, which means their niches grow smaller. And then an ecosystem can host more and more and more species. And it builds up a lot of repetition of function and critical functional roles. Like in decomposition, we don't just have a handful of fungi out there decomposing. We've got hundreds to thousands of species.
Mhm.
And that's where the resiliency comes in, because if one species goes extinct, the system's fine because it has all these other organisms doing the same functional role. So,
Wow. Yeah. That part is actually really, really cool. And I have watched one of your videos where you talked a lot about coevolution. And one of the cool things that you spoke of was how Virginia creeper won't go to the top of a tree and smother the tree out. It'll stop short of the canopy.
yeah, it sticks pretty much on
Yeah.
the trunk or on the limbs that don't have leaves, but it would be counterproductive for it to start covering over the the leaves and then prematurely kill its host, because then it's sort of done itself
Yeah.
in terms of getting a lot of light in a forest setting. So, you know, um, that's what happens. I mean, I'm sure when that relationship first started, it was probably like Eurasian bittersweet, covering up
Yeah.
trees, killing them off. But
Mhm.
it's sort of counterproductive from an energy point of view, because I've seen areas in New England where bittersweet has completely killed everything off. I know one
Mhm.
5-acre area where it's just a mat of bittersweet vine that's about 5 feet high. There's nothing else there. All the trees died. They eventually came down. The vines grown over them all. But now, if you look at it, you see that it's just twining all over itself, trying to grow up, and its fruiting and flowering goes way down. And so
Mhm.
it's not doing itself a good service by killing off its host trees like that.
Yeah. No, this is actually a topic we've been speaking on a little bit over the last few episodes of our podcast, and that is invasive species. And one thing that I wanted to ask you about is so I sort of believe in this concept of like, well, let me actually go back and just say that I personally believe that we will not ever be able to get rid of all of these invasive species on the landscape. I think that that's actually an impossible task, and most of the time it results in us poisoning the landscape. However, I do think that we should do something to help save native species where they are, right?
Yeah,
So,
I agree with you completely on that.
yeah,
Yeah, invasives, once they're here to stay. We don't have the capability to do it. So I look at it like triage. If you have a site that they're just starting to move into where it's easy to weed, go after them. If you
yeah,
got sites that have rare and endangered species, make sure you try to keep them out of there. And
yeah,
if you have the means to work other sites, you can do it. But um, eventually we're not going to get rid of them. And the places where they do establish will be the places coevolution will do its work. But, it takes, you know, 1,000 years maybe for them
mhm,
to start really working things out so that the ecosystem starts returning to some level of biotic diversity. But
yeah,
I'll agree with you completely. I think we just got to be strategic and not go nuts. Try to be like Noah in his ark and ferry our native species through until things can work themselves out. So, for an
yeah,
example, what we're seeing today is sort of child's play in a way to what would have happened 3 million years ago when
mhm,
the Isthmus of Panama formed, because North America and South America had been separated for, over 100 million years.
mhm,
And all of a sudden, that land bridge formed, and all sorts of species from North America migrated into South America, South American species coming up here. And the impact of invasives then would have been dramatic. But
mhm.
3 million years later, it's all okay. And all those South American species moved up this way are now functional members of our communities and vice versa. So nature's, patient, works things out through time. And we can do our part by making sure that we get our natives through this until that happens.
Yeah. Now, I have a question for you. Is it feasible to I mean, maybe not, but could people actively select for invasive species that have sort of these trait these like characteristics that would be like maybe geared better towards coevolution?
It's hard to say because I don't think we can predict exactly how it's all going to work. So let's say like something like Japanese knotweed, which really I think now is the biggest invasive worldwide. In terms, I think, of a root perennial, it now has the largest biomass of any root perennial in the world. This is
Hmm.
the case of in all continents. Um, but there's a huge energy resource there. All it's going to take is some organism to have some sort of change, a mutation, a change in behavioral strategy, where all of a sudden they start munching on that. And then
Hmm.
start getting a biological control, and things will start working from there to work it out. So I don't know if we can predict which ones would be the best to try to work with to develop that. I guess I just trust nature and letting it play out the way it's going to play out.
Yeah, that's another cool concept that I've been seeing a lot lately is the so over the last couple of years, I've been noting the autumn olive in my area, which I in northern Michigan, autumn olive is pretty persistent everywhere. We have very sandy soils, which autumn olive seems to thrive in. And what I've been noticing over the last few years is more and more deer browsing on them, and more rabbits eating the bark, stripping the bark off of the younger ones in the and actually like top killing them. And I was remarking recently that I thought that was a cool adaptation. What?
It is.
Yeah,
And you're right. And it is. And there's a resource there. So they can figure out that, well, maybe this isn't the tastiest stuff, but it works for us. Then yeah, then you start getting, now you're getting a process of coevolution taking place.
yeah, yeah. So what other kind of things have you been seeing, like maybe in your area, that might be like indicators of a future coevolution?
Oh, golly. I mean, well, a good one is, I mean, it's not a future one, but it just shows how far this can go, are oak ball galls. So,
Mhm.
leaf balls on oaks. You can get the apple gall, which is a solid, really hard, round gall that grows in the underside of oak leaves. The ball gall is hollow and has like actually these little rays of material going to a central area where the larvae exists. Um, Studies are showing now that when you look at those ball galls, that when they're growing, they're green, so they're photosynthetic. They're on the underside of the leaf where they don't block the oak's access to sunlight. And studies are showing that those galls produce more energy through photosynthesis that's embedded in them. So
Hmm.
any oak that gets one of these is actually getting an energy boost. And yet, when that first started as a brand new ecological relationship, it was probably a very, very nasty parasite, maybe even killed trees.
Hmm.
But that was not a good strategy, and coevolution pushed it along now to this mutually beneficial interaction.
That's amazing. And how long did you say, or did you say that has been around for?
I have no idea. I think they've
Oh,
been around pretty long. I mean, that's what I'm
oh,
saying. This usually
okay.
takes a pretty long time. So, you
Yeah.
know, for example, um, Eastern hemlock was throughout its present range in North America about 5,000 years ago.
Hmm.
Then all hemlock pollen disappears for 1,000 years. And then all of a sudden,
Really?
4,000 years ago, starts coming back. So we got some sort of, pathogen that came in that really took it out. But like most of these things, this is what's happening with our tree species. I don't think we're going to lose tree species. I think they're going to be decimated dramatically.
Hmm.
But there'll be some that, will have resistance, and that becomes the breeding population, and then they'll return. So, for example, I think since 2012, I've now come across 5 different stands of American chestnut that are regenerating. And these are
Really?
for American chestnut. These have nothing to do with hybrids or anything like that.
Yeah.
But they had some level of resistance that allows them to encapsulate the fungus and cankers, and they make it to about probably 60 years of age, but they probably had a good 30 years of reproductive time. And since American chestnut has to cross pollinate to make viable nuts, the offspring should have a higher level of resistance. So generation after generation, should start getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually just repopulate.
Yeah. Wow. That's pretty amazing. Yeah. The American chestnut is a tree that I highly value, and I'm not in their native range
Yeah.
where I'm at, but believe it or not, so there was an insane asylum put into the town that I live in a long time ago, and the guy in charge was extremely interested in planting edible nuts and trees and things, and just like all kinds of diverse trees that don't belong here. And we actually have some American chestnuts growing on the property of that place. And it's not an insane asylum anymore because those kind of went out of style. But it's now a place where it's like 500 acres of in-town park for people to walk around in. And I teach a lot of foraging classes out there. And when I show people the American chestnuts, they go, "Whoa, we have those things still?"
Yeah, but I mean and you're lucky you'll have them for a while because that's a disjunct population. So there are like some grand American chestnuts planted out in the Great Plains and stuff that are just isolated and they don't get hit by the blight fungus. Uh,
Mm,
but you need to make viable nuts and stuff. You need to have a population of them that are cross-pollinating.
yeah. The biggest issue that we face here, and ours do actually have blight.
Oh, they do.
Yeah, they do have blight, but the biggest problem that I actually face in gathering the nuts is that there's so few of the trees that they're wind pollinated, and they don't make that many nuts. And then the nuts that are there are quickly eaten by squirrels.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah. So is it an overstatement? Because I've heard that the American chestnut tree, it's been overstated how populated it actually was at one point in time. I wanted to ask an expert here. Was there actually like 4 billion, trees or whatever they said?
I don't know how many there were. I think in the heart of its range, there are some stands, or maybe one out of every four trees was American chestnut.
Mm,
But it certainly was probably not as densely populated as you often hear. But the thing is, they grew to immense size. So there are pre-blight photographs of American chestnuts up to 14-foot basal diameters. I mean,
mhm,
for a hardwood tree to get that size is hard to imagine. I mean, seen Doug fir and redwoods and sequoias and stuff at that size, but for a hardwood, it's hard. So I think because of the fact they could get so large and they could make such an incredible crop of nuts, they became sort of iconic in American folklore.
yeah. Um, do you believe or buy into the concept? And I mean, I personally do, but I want to ask you, um, of basically kind of like an intentional burning of the understory in these forests so that they would be predominating in nut bearing trees for the native populations that lived here.
Certainly, native peoples definitely use fire as a management tool. Around here in New England, it was used mostly along the riverways to clear out areas for garden plots on the
Mhm.
stone-free alluvial rich soils. In some sites in southern New England, they were burning forests that really had a good amount of white oak, shagbark, hickory, American chestnut to select for those trees, and then create understories of things like blueberries. So they were sort of doing permacultural practices. So I think in the right forest communities, it can definitely work. And I think a lot of our forests in the United States, particularly as you start getting down into the southeastern United States, the western United States, a lot of those forests were managed for a long time by indigenous people, and they evolved with a fire management regime. Other areas, like up here in northern New England, where I live, fire was pretty much nondescript as a natural disturbance. I mean, and we don't have as many nut trees you get in northern New England, so native people weren't burning like that up here.
Mhm.
But in areas of the continent where they did burn, they created ecosystems that did evolve with the presence of fire.
Wow. Um, that's pretty amazing. And I mean, do you think that that just comes from observation, or do you think that that just came from like some sort of intuitive moment from one person, or like a natural fire happens and then they go, "Wow, the game sure did increase around here."
Well, I think they were really connected to the natural world in an intimate way. So I'm
Mhm.
sure I mean, they know things about the natural world we still are learning today that's written in some of their stories of things that we've just found out about. So, connection between trees and the trees can communicate and things. I mean, these are all pretty recent things for us, found out in the last maybe 30 or 40 years. But
Yeah.
in people, I think, understood it because they were keen observers. They were out in the natural world solely. I mean, that was their home, that was their mother, that was everything. So it doesn't surprise me. I mean, they were every bit as observant and smart as we are, but even more keen and tuned into the natural world than I think we are today. No, it doesn't surprise me at all that they would get it, that, yeah, we can use this as a tool to manage things.
Yeah. One classic example of what you just mentioned was that a few years ago, I remember reading that they recently found out that prairie dogs cause rain on the Great Plains, and in the stories of Great Plains tribes, the prairie dogs were the rain bringers.
Yeah, well, there you go. And I didn't know that, but I wouldn't doubt it. I mean, I think so many organisms play roles in ecosystems that I think you have to look at an ecosystem in a holistic way, that all these organisms are interacting and they're doing things together that um, wouldn't happen otherwise. And they create these emergent properties and things. So it doesn't surprise me at all that prairie dogs in some way could be influencing weather patterns like that to bring more rainfall. I mean, I don't know how they're doing it because I've never heard about this, but it wouldn't surprise me.
So apparently, according to the research that I read, prairie dogs dig down these big elaborate tunnels, and then what that does is it causes a transpiration,
Hmm.
an evaporation of the water from the subsoil into the air, which then causes rain clouds to form.
Oh,
And then you take those out of the landscape, and all of a sudden it becomes this dust bowl.
yeah. So I
And
wonder, like, I mean, I can get that because if they're going to, like usually evaporation, in let's say prairie areas, it probably doesn't get down much more than a few feet. But if they're getting down 6 feet, 7 feet, 8 feet, and getting down to moist soils, sure, I can make that make sense to me.
Yeah. But I just think that that's very cool. Like you said, like they had it in their stories,
Mhm.
the prairie dog is the bringer of rain, and then
Yeah.
that was just like a folk tale, but then we with our white lab coats, we go in and we go, hey, you guys were
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And they're like, duh.
Yeah, right. Well, I guess
So
if you've been around observing these things for thousands and thousands of years, yeah, you get it.
yeah. So earlier on, you mentioned that there was some pretty that you teach classes and that you'll go through some pretty elaborate like symbiotic species that are together. Can you name some of them like that would be of interest?
Well, I mean, I was saying, our recent understanding of things like, Suzanne Simard's work with mycorrhizal fungi.
Mhm.
We had no idea. I remember when I, again, did my undergraduate work in UNH, I was just taught that trees simply compete. They're
Mhm.
individuals out there, they're competing. We know that's not the case, that, mycorrhizal fungi network all these plants in a forest together and energy nutrients going back and forth. So yeah, there may be some competition to get in the canopy, but below ground, there is a lot happening that's mutually beneficial. Her work has shown that certain times a year.
On average, it takes about 30 days for a person to break their New Year's resolution. So if saving money was on your 2024 list, your odds aren't really looking that great. Luckily, I have a 100% guaranteed way to save you money this year. Just switch to Mint Mobile right now. Mint Mobile has wireless plans starting at just $15 a month. That's unlimited talk, text, and data for $15 a month. If you save as much as I think you're going to, you are going to be able to afford a brand new rod and reel. Use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and keep your same phone number along with all of your existing contacts. To get your new wireless plan for $15 a month and get the plan shipped to your door for free, go to mintmobile.com/waypoint. That's mintmobile.com/waypoint. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/waypoint. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
Isn't the point of traveling to get away from it all? To feel the best you've ever felt? Then maybe you should check out Aruba. You'll spend your time relaxing on cool, white, sandy beaches and floating in healing blue water. You'll meet locals brimming with gratitude for an island that redefines what a paradise can be. When your trip comes to an end, you won't need another vacation because you just had the vacation. That's the Aruba effect. Plan your trip at Aruba.com.
Mycorrhizal fungi are extracting energy for paper birch in the study she did in British Columbia and feeding Douglas fir trees, and then that flow is reversed at other times of the year. So all of a sudden, that's like, that doesn't look sort of like competition. There's something else going on. So that's just one, but there's so many. I mean, if you look at here, I live on the coast of Maine, so we get a lot of ocean fog. So our trees are just coated in lichens.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard arborists say that, they go into a forest and they see or they go into somebody's yard and they see this tree who has, the crown is declining. There's lichens all over the branches. They say, look at that. Those lichens are killing the tree. And actually, that's not what's going on at all. The limiting factor for lichens is light. They're only biologically active during fog or rain events. So light becomes a premium. So wherever there's no leaves, that's where they're going to grow, because that's where the light is. But lichens get most of their nutrients out of the air. So when they start coating a tree, it's like putting this nutrient layer on the tree. So then during heavy rain, some of that nutrient leaches out as water-soluble fertilizer that goes right down to the ground and fertilizes the roots of the trees. Or if they fall off, they enrich the ground. So trees that get good lichen coatings actually get a boost. They're benefited. So trees like red oaks, for example, almost all of our trees have barks that, exfoliate. Red oaks have evolved a bark that on a live, healthy red oak, you can't remove any bark. It is welded on in adaptation to attract these lichens. They can get heavy coatings on their trunks in areas where there's a good amount of light. So there's just one common one.
Yeah, the lichen thing is pretty interesting. So, when you said that, what was killing the trees though? So if it's not the lichens,
it's not the lichen. So in that case, like a lot of this you see in spruce around here, spruce are having a hard time with climate change and some exotic fungi. So we see that a lot in spruce trees. So it's another agent that's doing it, and then the lichens are just taking advantage of the light that opens up.
Okay, I see. Yeah, lichens are really fascinating, and I appreciate that you said that some people do, I'll hear people say like a lichen, they act like it's a predator, it's like stealing the nutrients from the tree, and I will remark that no, it's actually gathering all of its nutrients from the air.
That's right. I mean, they're growing on dead bark. They're not taking anything from the tree. It would be like these are long-lived, co-evolved relationships. It again doesn't make sense to hurt your host. If you keep your host going, it lives longer, you live longer, you reproduce more, there's more of a resource for your offspring. So for example, we're talking about chestnut blight. It only took about 30 years for that blight to pretty much extirpate American chestnut completely. Obviously a really bad outcome for the American chestnut. That's why, as ecologists, we say we shouldn't be bringing species from one part of the world into another, because we create these very young ecological interactions that can be very detrimental. But take a look at it from the fungus's perspective. If you're a host-specific parasite, the worst thing you could do is eradicate your host species. You've just gotten rid of your whole population, and it was incredibly energy wasteful. It would have been much better off to keep their host trees alive, even if they're parasites. They'd live longer, reproduce more of a resource for their offspring. So it only makes sense through time that these co-evolved relationships are going to develop, which makes ecosystems way, way more biologically diverse and resilient.
Yeah. So in regards to the American chestnut, you said you didn't think that, we weren't talking about hybrids. What do you think about hybridization events between those species? Do you think that's bad or good?
Well, I would have lobbied against it. I think we're too hasty in what we do, and we don't understand the outcome. So, the Oriental chestnuts that are being hybridized are basically understory species that never could get the sort of stature of the American chestnut.
Yeah.
American chestnut will come back, but what worries me, there's going to be enough of these hybrids, and now we're talking about genetic manipulations and stuff that who knows what that species will become. And I don't
Yeah.
think we can predict. So I'd say we don't really have the wisdom to understand this. I think it's more or less, if we find resistant chestnuts, we should have worked with them. It would take longer, but I don't think we should be so hasty. I think that especially when we don't understand all the outcomes of what we're doing, I don't think I think it's blind to just rush in like that.
Yeah. And as far as like I wanted to mention the chestnut that the genetically modified one. I think that got they put the kibosh on that one. I think they're
Well,
not
that's
doing
good.
that
I haven't
anymore.
heard that, and that's really good. I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah, it worries me because you create these genetic new forms and we don't know how they're going to interact in ecosystems. And you can then lose your original form, which is
Yeah.
not good.
Yeah, definitely. So I wanted to ask you specifically about oaks. Oaks, as I'm sure you're aware, at one point in time, kind of diverged into red oaks and white oaks, and then as I've gleaned from the information, they sort of they evolved like I think 5 million years ago in Colorado or something. I had told, and then sort
Oh,
of made it. Yeah,
they're way older than that.
yeah, okay,
The oaks are in the Fagaceae. This is the beech
yeah.
family. It's one of our oldest families of broadleaf trees. The only family that's older are magnolias. So it's a family evolved in equatorial tropics about, I don't know, over 100 million years ago.
Oh, okay.
I now when they got up here in North America, probably not until that land isthmus formed that they came
Hmm.
up on. So, in other words, it might have been 3 million years ago they made it into here. But they still have sort of some of their tropical attributes. So, for example, um, they have marcescent leaves. These are leaves that they die, they hang on the tree, which is when you're up north where there's a lot of snow or ice storms, that's not a good strategy. You can really capture a lot of weight and get breakage events. But all the early members of that family were broad-leaved evergreens because they grew in
Hmm.
equatorial tropics. And so if we go down to the southern United States, we have live oaks that are broad-leaved evergreens. And if you go down in South America now, we still have beeches that are broad-leaved evergreens. But the beech, the oak, the chestnut are all in that family. They all have marcescent leaves because they're sort of more recent arrivers up here and they never mastered the art of dropping them.
Wow. Okay. It's so funny to think of 3 million years as being recent.
Yeah, well, I think you have to look at it in perspective of what's going on historically, but yeah, it's
Yeah,
all for context, I guess.
yeah, no, I get you for sure. Um, but the question that I wanted to ask you though was about so red and white oaks, they inhabit these different groups. What what makes them like they can both be in the same site? And you were talking about earlier coevolution and energy efficiency. So what is specifically like the difference between like why a white oak will be where a white oak is and why a red oak will be where a red oak is?
Yeah, so I mean, here I'll just have to play on my knowledge in New England here. White oaks are more southerly in range distribution. Like, we
Mhm.
have red oaks up here in coastal Maine. White oaks don't make it up here at all. So
Mhm.
white oaks predominantly have done better in New England, south facing pretty hot, dry sites. And they're more fire adapted. That flakier bark is a more fire adapted bark than the bark of red oak. So they do better on these sites that are drier, warmer, things like that, where red oak is better on, sort of more moderate sites in terms of moisture and stuff. At least that's the way it is here in New England. Now, I should say both of them have these shade leaves and sun leaves. I think I mentioned that earlier. If you go out in an oak woodland, whether it's white oak or red oak, it doesn't really matter. If you look on the ground, you're going to see, some oak leaves that are pretty small and others that might be 3 to 4 times the size.
Mhm.
And the small ones usually are more deeply notched in the midrib. They are more leathery because they have a heavy cuticular coating. And these are the sun leaves. They are leaves that hang out in the top of the tree in full sunlight They have small size and that heavy coating to protect them from desiccation. But the deep notches allowed a lot of light to infiltrate in the interior leaves. And so what the oaks are doing, they've been around a long time, so they've mastered a lot of this stuff, is they're creating a microenvironment where their shade leaves, those big interior leaves, can do the bulk of the photosynthesis without moisture loss. So that's why, at least here in New England, when we get on dry sites, oaks will predominate over any other broadleaf hardwood because they can do about 30% more photosynthesis because it's leaf dimorphism. So, but
Wow.
here we're seeing white oaks more on drier, warmer sites than red oaks.
That's fascinating. And then what species do you have in Maine? Michigan has 10 species of oak, and then northern Michigan's got, I think, 3.
Well, I'm right where I am on Mount Desert Island. We have 2 species of oak. We've got red oak and scrub oak. But
Okay.
in New England, if you get down to southern New England, then you get a whole mess more. But you're going to get, white oaks and pin oaks and scarlet oaks, and we can get some bur oaks out in the western part of New England. So it depends where you are. But up here, I'm in down east coastal Maine, so I'm up at about the 45th parallel. So it's getting shorter growing seasons. We get a lot more cool conditions, particularly with ocean fogs, and the oaks just don't
Yeah.
do well.
Yeah, you're so you say you're at the 45th parallel. That's basically exactly where I am in Michigan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're on, the Gulf of Maine, which is a pretty cold body of water, although it's warming dramatically fast.
Yeah.
It used to be that it would be rare for it to get much above 50 degrees in the summertime. Now we're getting it up in some areas close to 60, which is a dramatic warming. That's happened just like in the last 20 years.
So it was you've lived there for a long time?
No, we bought a place up here 10 years ago and then moved up here permanently 2 years ago.
Okay. But you've been there for a long time. So it would not get above 50 degrees in the summer?
In the water of the ocean, yeah.
In the
Yeah,
water
yeah,
of
yeah.
the ocean.
Oh, no,
Oh,
no, not in the air here, but out in the Gulf of Maine waters. Yes, no, yeah, no.
okay.
It would be
I,
pretty tough if it's just 50 degrees at the warmest time of year.
okay, I gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. I was thinking, well, that doesn't sound like a great retirement place. um, but the yeah, so here where I live in particular, I live in Traverse City, Michigan. Um, we actually I remark about this all the time. Southern Michigan, if you go east of us, is colder, even if you go south. So like Chicago is a much colder place than we are here. And that's because I live right on Lake Michigan and the wind it just keeps this moderate all year.
Yeah,
So
no, it's amazing, like, again, how big lakes, oceans, things like this can really change the physical environment quite a bit.
yeah. So what in changing gears here, what got you into all this stuff?
Well, I think it's an unusual story. I talk about it now that my mom passed away, but when I was a young boy, at the age of 4, she developed mental illness. My older siblings were off at school, so I was at home alone with her, and it got to be scary at times. So I would just head out into the woods across the street. Um, and I felt comfortable being there. It felt sort of like a sanctuary for me. So at a very young age, I really bonded with just being out in the woods. Of course, as a young boy, I didn't have much respect for it. I can remember ripping up huge stands of skunk cabbage to try to make the neighbors a disagreeable smell. Did thing that boys do, which is not the best thing sometimes, but I still bonded with that woodland. And I write about it in one of my books that when I was 12, uh, and this was in the spring of my 6th grade year, stayed after school in a pickup baseball game, started walking home from the school through the woods. It was a half-mile walk through the woods to get to my house, and came across this new dirt road that had been punched through the woods, came to a clearing where there was a stand of red maples I just loved because they had this bark that looked like shagbark hickories, and they'd all been pushed down. And me and my 2 friends who lived on the same street right across from this woods were aghast. And so we monkey wrenched that bulldozer. I'd never even heard of the term at that time, because this was like 1963, I guess.
Mhm.
But we picked up rocks, we smashed all the windows, we poked holes for the leather seats, we pried off hydraulic hoses with sticks, we pushed gears, rocks in every gear we can find. We even took dirt from the exposed tracks and dumped it in the gas tank.
Oh my God.
And I guess we really did some damage because the police really were investigating this. And I remember during True Confessions one time at a Thanksgiving dinner when I was in my 40s, I mentioned this, and my parents just blanched because I guess they've been interviewed quite a bit about the police and saying, "Oh no, Tommy would never do anything like that." But anyways, then I became an adolescent, and sort of my interest changed. But I did. I was good in high school in math and science. My dad said, "You'll make a great engineer." And I hadn't even thought about what I wanted to do. I said, "Okay." So I went to Johns Hopkins University to study industrial engineering. It only took me a month to realize that is not what I want to do. So for the first time in my life, I started thinking, and I knew it had to be something with forests. So that was the beginning of my trajectory into basically being an ecologist.
Wow. And as an ecologist, what is your favorite thing that you get to do?
The favorite thing I get to do?
Yeah.
Wander in incredible landscapes. It's interesting. I mean, I was trained to be a research ecologist, and I did it. I could do research, but I quickly learned that it wasn't my predilection. I didn't want to stay stuck in a point just collecting data. I'd be up in the Rockies and come across a mountain lion track, and I'd start backtracking it. And I don't know how many days of research I lost because I got distracted and started wandering. So yeah, I wasn't lost. Not all those that wander are lost, but I'm a wanderer, and I just wander,
Yeah.
look. And I think that's what allowed me to develop my abilities of interpreting forest histories. Is I've developed a really good eye for seeing differences in patterns and processes. And once I see a difference, it starts me thinking about what's going on, and I pursue that. So, but you wouldn't do that if you were stuck just doing sort of quantitative research. You wouldn't see those changes. You wouldn't see it on a grander, larger scale. So I guess that's, why I became an educator, because I found I loved teaching. I could do the research, but it didn't tickle me.
Yeah. Um, I too am an insane wanderer.
Mhm.
I have it in me, and I have three kids and a family. And prior to having all these kids, I mean, I can't tell you the amount of time I used to just wander, just what's over here, what's over
Yeah,
there,
yeah.
and just kind of go where places like most people don't want to go. I seem to be really drawn towards wetlands, and
Mhm.
so
Which are really cool.
yeah, yeah, wetlands are amazing. And what do you think that is? What makes people like you and me just want to like wander?
I don't know if I can say exactly why. That's what I did when I was 4 years old. I was wandering through those woods. Maybe it's just something that I picked up. I don't know why, but I just know that that's my predilection. Um, for example, I taught a desert ecology class at Antioch Graduate School for many, many years down in Mexico and bordering Arizona. And I'd always intentionally give one day off as a day
Mhm.
for people just to wander on their own through the desert and not have
Wow.
any restrictions in that. And I would take off for the whole day, and I'd go huge distances in this. We'd always do this in the Pinacate, which is this incredible desert landscape in Mexico. And truly, it was a wilderness landscape until the early 1900s. Hardly any white people had ever been in there. Uh,
Mhm.
he said Adam had lived in there, but in very small population because it's a very extreme place to live. But um, I'd go out wandering and come across these incredible footpaths that were probably at least 10,000 years old in the desert
Holy
page.
moly.
And actually, there's a debate that some people are saying they're 35,000 years old based on desert varnish of the rocks that have been pushed to the sides, and came across huge intaglio, you know, things out there of wild animals and stuff the native people had done. And it's just like I'd see these things and I just became hooked. I just had to keep going, like you in the wetland. Just what's over there? What am I going to
Mhm.
find? And
Yeah.
um, yeah.
So, a desert. I had no idea that you were this desert expert, but that brings me up to another question I have for you then. Um, is it true that like when we look at a desert, what we're seeing is actually like the last remnants of what was once like this like really flourishing landscape? Like
It it's changed dramatically over the, you know, 40, 50 years I've been going down there regularly. I mean, for example, in the Pinacate, which I think has one of the most diverse floras that I know of in the Sonoran Desert, um, there used to be saguaro cacti, Sonita cacti, desert lavender, brittle bush, all these all these amazing desert plants. And you go down there nowadays, and they're almost all really hard to find. Creosote's taken off, and it's just the droughts down there getting so severe, and the temperatures are getting so hot. Because this is a volcanic landscape that has black cindery substrates. So,
Mhm.
surface temperatures down there probably getting up 180 degrees or more. And, it's really changing it dramatically from what used to be a very, very lush, very diverse desert ecosystem to one now that's very, very different.
How do we help that?
I don't know if we can at this point. I think this is the sort of things that will have to work themselves out through time. Uh,
Okay.
what's happening is, luckily, there are in that region of North America, there are mountains, and so deserts are moving up slope, sort of the way,
Mhm.
you know, other ecosystems that are in mountains are doing it. So I think those can become refugia, and then, and I'm sure that, what we're seeing with climate change will start reversing course, probably sometime in the next few hundred to maybe 1,000 years. And they'll return. They'll come back down again, and things will probably start moving back out again. So, um, yeah, I have hope that in the long term it'll be fine, but you're going to see a lot of changes in the short term.
Yeah, I saw a video recently of a guy that was he went to visit a paper birch stand that was native to an area, but it was isolated by hundreds and hundreds of miles. And that actually reminds me of what you just said because as climate changes, we're gonna start to see these populations move into these areas, and they're gonna colonize new places. And what will end up probably happening is we'll over time that climate will shift back, and then we might have like a remnant population stuck somewhere.
Yeah,
You know.
it's possible. I mean, like if you go up to Cape Breton Island on the north shore of Cape Breton Island, you get into ecosystems that are just like being down in Pennsylvania. They are disjunct because during the hypsothermal about 6,000 years ago, it was a much, much warmer climate and everything migrated up and then it cooled off and it all restricted. And they're right on the shore by a really warm current. So they were able
Mhm.
to exist, but they're like it's white oaks way up there that are really disjunct. I mean, they're hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away from where you can find any of the white oaks.
Wow.
Yeah.
So this brings up another question for me. Um, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, the Black Hills, and then the West Coast and Alaska, they all have what would it be? Thimbleberries.
Uh-huh.
And thimbleberries. What causes a native population to be that disjunct? You have Alaska, the
Yeah.
Black Hills of South Dakota, and then the Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
Yeah. So again, I think probably, I'm guessing, I don't know this for sure because I don't know their ecology, but it's probably going back to the hypsothermal where their ranges were probably much bigger and maybe not so disjunct. And
Mhm.
now they're restricted in these little pockets. We've seen the same thing with, other species like the white oak I mentioned. So that would be my guess. I don't know the full story though of them.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating with thimbleberries because they're all the rage in the UP. Every summer, you get all these people going out and picking thimbleberries, and then meanwhile, they're largely pretty much ignored in Alaska, and because they're just like this big sour raspberry.
That's right. And you have lots of like things like incredible blueberries and
Yeah,
bilberries and other stuff. Yeah.
yeah. So what other things are you getting? We're kind of coming up here on an hour. I just want to say, like, how can people follow you? How can people sign up for courses? Like, what things are you getting into?
Well, I don't have a website intentionally because we get asked, my wife is my business manager, and we get way more requests than we can handle anyway. So we don't advertise it, but people can go to Antioch University and find my website and get my email if they're saying, are you doing anything in this area? I mean, the last thing I did was actually, I was scheduled to go up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and then the pandemic hit. So I ended up doing a Zoom program
Oh, wow.
for people in Michigan. And they said, we're going to get you back, and I'm waiting to see if they will. But if I get that way, I'll be sure to let you know, Clay, and then you can know.
Oh, I would die for that opportunity, Tom. That would be amazing. And then is New England Forest, is that the only videos that people can find of you online?
There are probably some others, but those those are the ones that I think are the best. I mean, Ray Aslan, who's the filmmaker, and I mentioned this to you before we got going recording. He had retired, and this just became a hobby, but he's gotten good at it, and his stuff has taken off. So, yeah, pretty much, the stuff on interpreting forest history, treating the forest and landscape, coevolution. Ray did the best stuff on that.
Okay. And then your books, you have how many so far?
Well, that I've solely written 6. There's a 7th book that was jointly written by me and another person.
Okay. Great. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation with you, Tom. As mentioned, I think you're an inspiration to all of us wandery people out there.
Good.
And,
that's like a clan kinship,
yeah. And yeah, I hope that everybody listening goes out and gets one of your books and takes some time to just see what's out there. I mean, I personally believe that it does help us with foraging and hunting, which is why I had you on the podcast.
Well, if you start doing the work I'm doing, you start seeing things in a greater holistic way, which I think would be helpful because you start seeing patterns, and all of a sudden those patterns you can think about, well, I bet this is relating to this and this and this, which could directly relate to foraging and stuff. So it makes sense to me.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for coming on, and maybe in a year or so we'll catch up again and see if you got anything else going on.
All right. Well, thanks, Clay. It's delightful being on.
And once again, thank you so much for listening to the Publicly Challenged podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, please subscribe on whatever platform it is you're listening to. Also, if you could leave a review, that would help us out. And you can check us out on Instagram or at publiclychallenged.com. And once again, thank you so much for listening to the show.
Pursuing wild game in wild places. Tune in to Hunt Stand Presents Saturdays at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. Waypoint TV, the destination for outdoor entertainment.